I'll give you the plane if you can fly. Thomas Whitmore's laughter echoed through the private hangar like a thunderclap of derision as he pointed at the 62-year-old black woman, who stood silently watching the gleaming executive jet. Deborah Williams stood motionless in front of the $20 million Cessna Citation X+, her calloused hands clutching a worn plastic bag. Under the halogen lights of the Miami hangar, his threadbare coat stood in stark contrast to the Italian suits of the businessmen attending the aircraft sales demonstration. The cruel comment came as she approached to admire the cockpit through the open window. Whitmore, heir to an oil fortune and owner of a personal fleet of aircraft, had noticed the inappropriate presence of her at the exclusive event for millionaire buyers. "Look at that," he continued, gesturing theatrically to the others present. "You must be lost. This isn't exactly the kind of place where people like his usually hang out." The guests' laughter multiplied. Middle-aged men wearing Rolex watches and women adorned with designer jewelry watched the spectacle as if it were scheduled entertainment. The dealership saleswoman, Jennifer, discreetly tried to signal security. Deborah took a deep breath, his eyes scanning every detail of the aircraft with a familiarity that no one there could quite interpret. There was something in the way she examined the controls, the way his fingers almost touched the fuselage, that revealed much more than it appeared. 47 years, she murmured softly, more to herself than to anyone else present. "What?" asked Whitmore, approaching arrogantly. "Are you talking about her age or how long it will take her to understand how a real plane works?" More laughter. More calculated humiliation. But Deborah didn't take her eyes off the aircraft. His eyes shone with a silent intensity, as if each insult only fueled an inner flame that remained carefully hidden. 47 years flying, she repeated, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before exploding into even louder laughter. Whitmore doubled over, clutching his stomach as if she had heard the most absurd joke of her life. "Flying," he shouted between laughs. "She said flying. As if she's ever set foot on a plane that wasn't the cheapest airline possible." It was then that something changed in Deborah's expression. It wasn't anger or fear, but a dangerous calm that made some of those present feel inexplicably uncomfortable. It was the serenity of someone who carries secrets too powerful to be revealed at the wrong moment. "If he's so sure I can't fly," she said, her voice firm, "why not make her joke interesting?" The provocation fell in the hangar like a silent bomb. Everyone stopped laughing, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Her, who should have been intimidated and leaving in shame, had just challenged one of the richest men in Miami in front of witnesses. Whitmore blinked, displaced for the first time that night. His mouth opened and closed as if searching for an appropriate response to something completely outside the script of humiliation he had planned. And there, under the curious gaze of everyone present, Deborah Williams remained silent, her silence laden with unspoken promises, like someone who knows exactly what is about to happen, even when no one else can imagine it. If you're enjoying this story of twists and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen in this hangar will completely redefine everything these people thought they knew about underestimating those they shouldn't. Thomas Whitmore couldn't stop laughing. The situation had become his personal entertainment for the evening, and he was determined to extract every drop of fun possible from this improvised comedy. He gestured dramatically to the other guests, like a conductor conducting a symphony of derision. "Did you hear that?" he shouted, wiping imaginary tears from his eyes. 47 years flying. Maybe she's been counting since she was a passenger on the city bus. Laughter multiplied throughout the hangar. Richard Blackstone, another tycoon present to evaluate the aircraft, took a photo with his cell phone. "This is going to go viral on social media," he commented maliciously. "Beggar claims to be a pilot at a $20 million event." Jennifer, the saleswoman, whispered nervously to the security guard, "Maybe we should ask her to leave." But Thomas raised his hand, interrupting any attempt to end the show. No, let her stay. I want to see how far this fantasy goes." Deborah remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the aircraft. There was something about the way she observed every detail of the cockpit that disturbed some of the more attentive attendees. It wasn't the admiration of a layman, it was technical analysis. She studied the instruments as if checking a mental list. 47 years, she repeated once more, and this time her voice carried a weight that made Thomas, smile falter momentarily. A quick flashback hit her. She was 17, the only black woman in a class of pilots in 1976. The instructors doubted her, Her classmates mocked her, her employers hesitated to hire her. But she flew. God, how she flew. Ma'am, Marcus Stevens, an older businessman who had been watching the scene with growing discomfort, interjected, perhaps it would be better. No, Deborah interrupted him gently but firmly. Mr. Whitmore made an offer to her. She's considering accepting it. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer collective amusement, it was genuine astonishment. No one expected her to take the provocation seriously. Thomas blinked several times, as if trying to process what he had just heard. You're serious? He stammered, her confidence wavering for the first time. Perfectly serious, Deborah replied, finally turning to face him directly. You said you'd give me this plane if I could fly it. I'm accepting the challenge. The tension in the hangar shifted instantly. What had been cruel entertainment turned into something more serious and dangerous. Thomas felt control of the situation slipping through his fingers. Wait a minute, he said, trying to regain his authority. That was a joke. No one here expects you to actually. A joke. Deborah tilted her head slightly. In front of all these witnesses? With $20 million in sales contracts at stake. She gestured calmly to the guests. I'm sure everyone here is a person of their word. Jennifer swallowed hard. The situation was spiraling out of control in a way that could seriously jeopardize the sale. Richard continued to record everything, clearly anticipating that it would go viral for reasons very different from what she had imagined. Thomas, cornered by his own arrogance, felt his anger rising. You have no idea what you're doing, he growled, her voice losing any pretense of cordiality. This isn't a toy. It's a $20 million machine that requires years of specialized training. I know exactly what it is, Deborah replied with a calmness that contrasted sharply with his growing agitation. Cessna Citation X+, Rolls-Royce AE305A2 engines, cruising speed of Mach 0.92, flight ceiling of 15,200 meters. The silence that followed was deafening. Each technical specification had come out of her mouth with the precision of an operating manual. The businessmen present looked at each other, bewildered. This was not information one learned by watching YouTube videos. Thomas turned pale. How do you know that? Deborah smiled for the first time that evening. It wasn't a smile of submission or nervousness. It was the smile of someone who had just revealed the tip of a much larger iceberg. The real question, she said, taking a step toward the aircraft, is, do you have the courage to honor your word when you discover that you have completely underestimated the person standing in front of you? Marcus Stevens whispered to his wife, something is very wrong here. She knows too much. Thomas, sensing that he was losing control of the narrative in front of potential millionaire buyers, decided to up the ante. If she wanted public humiliation, he would give her exactly that. Very well, he said, her voice trembling with contained rage. You want to play games? Let's play games. But when you fail, and you will fail, I want her to kneel right here and apologize to every person in this room for wasting our time. The challenge hung in the air like a physical threat. The guests stirred, some clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. But Deborah didn't back down an inch. Deal, she said simply. And when I manage to fly this plane, you sign the transfer of ownership in front of everyone here. That will never happen, Thomas laughed, but her laughter sounded forced now. Jennifer tried to intervene. Gentlemen, perhaps we could. No, Deborah interrupted her gently. Let this man learn that some bets cost more than he can afford. And there, as everyone present watched that unlikely escalation of tension, no one could have imagined that they were about to witness not only the flight of a $20 million aircraft, but the complete destruction of everything Thomas Whitmore believed he knew about power, privilege, and the dangerous art of underestimating those he shouldn't. What those millionaires still didn't understand was that every insult, every laugh, and every gesture of contempt was fueling something much more powerful than his collective arrogance. It was fueling the silent determination of a woman who carried secrets capable of completely rewriting that night and possibly the rest of her lives. The tension in the hangar had completely changed direction. What had started as cruel entertainment now seemed like a high-stakes gamble that no one could predict the outcome of. Thomas Whitmore, accustomed to controlling any situation through money and intimidation, felt for the first time in years that something was slipping out of his control. Very well, he said, trying to regain authority with a forced laugh. If you insist on this fantasy, let's make it interesting. He turned to the guests with theatrical gestures. When she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone to see what happens when people like her try to play in our league. Deborah remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the aircraft. There was something in her posture that made Jennifer, the saleswoman, approach her discreetly. 15 years of selling luxury aircraft had taught her to read people. And everything about that woman contradicted her outward appearance. "Ma'am," Jennifer whispered softly, Whitmore isn't joking. If this goes wrong, the consequences could be serious." Deborah turned to her with a gentle smile. "Thank you for your concern, dear. But some battles must be fought, regardless of the consequences." Marcus Stevens, the older businessman, watched the scene with growing discomfort. There was something deeply wrong with this situation. The technical knowledge her had demonstrated was not something that could be learned casually. It was decades of expertise. "Thomas," he whispered, tugging the host by the sleeve. "Maybe you should reconsider this. There's something different about her." "Different?" Thomas laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The only thing different is that she has more courage to humiliate herself than I expected." Meanwhile, Deborah approached the aircraft and began a visual inspection of the exterior. His movements were systematic, professional. She checked the tires, examined the control surfaces, observed the engine air intakes. Every gesture revealed a familiarity that left the more curious observers baffled. Richard Blackstone, still recording everything with his cell phone, whispered to her, "This isn't right. She moves as if she knows exactly what she's doing." "Pre-flight check," Deborah muttered to herself, but loud enough for some to hear. "Control surfaces free and correct. Tires in proper condition. Air intakes clear." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was no longer mockery or disbelief. It was a gradual recognition that these were not words memorized from a manual, but automatic procedures from someone who had done this thousands of times. Thomas, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, decided to escalate the humiliation even further. "Enough theater," he shouted. "Anyone can memorize a few technical words. The real test is up there." He gestured dramatically toward the cockpit. "But before you soil the interior of my aircraft with his dirty hands, let's establish some rules." Deborah stared at him with that disconcerting calm. "I'm listening." "First," Thomas began, walking around her like a predator, "when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to apologize on your knees to every person here." Uncomfortable murmurs arose among the guests. Some were beginning to realize that the situation had crossed the line of what was acceptable. "Second," he continued, ignoring the disapproving looks, "you pay for the cleaning and maintenance costs of the aircraft after you damage it. And third," her voice became cruel, "you publicly admit that people like her don't belong in places like this." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Jennifer lowered her eyes, ashamed to be associated with that scene. Marcus Stevens shook his head in disapproval. Even Richard stopped recording, clearly uncomfortable. Deborah took a deep breath. For a moment, something changed in her expression. The lines of fatigue around her eyes seemed to deepen, and everyone could see decades of struggle and discrimination etched on his face. But then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was not a smile of submission or nervousness. It was the smile of someone who had just heard exactly what she needed to justify what he was about to do. "I accept your terms, she said calmly. "All of them." Thomas blinked, surprised by the ease of her acceptance. He had expected resistance, argument, perhaps even that she would give up. The absolute calm of her was beginning to unsettle him in a way he couldn't understand. "But," Deborah continued, her voice still low but charged with something new, "I want you to honor your part of the agreement when I succeed." "When?" Thomas laughed, but the laughter sounded hollow. "You mean if?" "No," Deborah replied, and for the first time her voice carried an authority that made everyone stop whispering. "I said when." It was then that Jennifer noticed something that made her gulp. While everyone was arguing, Deborah had discreetly examined the aircraft documentation on the counter. But she wasn't just looking, she was reading with the speed and familiarity of someone who understood every technical specification. "Ma'am," Jennifer whispered, approaching her again, "may I ask where you learned about aviation?" Deborah looked at her fondly. "Honey, after 47 years of flying, you learn a thing or two." 47 years, Jennifer repeated, and something clicked in her mind. When did you start? 1976, Deborah replied simply. The mental calculation made Jennifer stagger. If that woman was telling the truth, she had started flying when commercial aviation was even more exclusively female and white than it is today. For a black woman to get a pilot's license at that time. My God, Jennifer whispered, but Thomas was too busy preparing his next verbal attack to notice. Enough talk, he declared, climbing onto the platform next to the aircraft. Let's get this comedy over with. Deborah approached the cockpit access ladder. Before climbing up, she turned to the guests present. His eyes scanned each face, memorizing every expression of doubt, every smirk, every look of contempt. Just one question before we begin, she said, her voice echoing through the hangar. How many of you have flown a Citation X+? A few nervous laughs emerged, but no one answered directly. It was obvious that these were buyers, not pilots. How many of you know the difference between a full flap landing and a partial flap landing in crosswind conditions? The silence was complete now. These weren't casual questions. They were specific technical questions that only his experienced pilots would know. How many of you, her voice became firmer, have saved lives through aviation? Thomas tried to interrupt, but something about Deborah's presence silenced him. There was a gravity to her words that transcended the immediate situation. Because I, she continued, placing her hand on the fuselage of the aircraft, have spent 47 years not only flying, but proving every day that I deserve to be in the skies. And today, in front of all of you, I will prove it once again. She began to climb the access ladder, but stopped on the first step. Thomas, she said without turning around. I hope you have the transfer documents ready, his voice. The absolute confidence in her voice made everyone present exchange uneasy glances. It wasn't bravado or bluster, it was the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. Marcus Stevens whispered to his wife, "Something tells me we're about to witness something we'll never forget." Jennifer, watching Deborah disappear inside the aircraft, felt a chill run down her spine. 15 years of selling to millionaires and billionaires had taught her to recognize real power when she saw it. And at that moment, as the Citation's engines prepared to roar, she was absolutely certain that the real power in that hangar wasn't in the bank accounts of the men in suits. It was in the calloused hands of a woman who carried decades of sky in her heart and was about to rewrite every rule those men thought they knew. What none of those present could have imagined was that when Deborah started those engines, she would not only be flying a $20 million aircraft, she would be flying with the weight of a story that would forever change the way every person in that hangar would view courage, dignity, and the real price of underestimating those who should not be underestimated. The moment Deborah started the engines of the Citation X+ was when Thomas Whitmore realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The perfect roar of the Rolls-Royce turbofans filled the hangar with a precision that only extremely experienced hands could achieve. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way she adjusted the instruments with automatic movements, how his fingers danced over the controls without hesitation, how she checked each system with a sequence that revealed decades of experience. "This isn't right," Thomas whispered to Richard, who continued to record everything with his cell phone. His voice trembled for the first time that night. "She's doing this as if she were a professional pilot," Jennifer finished, watching through the cockpit window. During 15 years of selling aircraft, she had seen hundreds of experienced pilots. What she was witnessing now was more than experience, it was virtuosity. Deborah activated the hangar's internal radio. Her voice echoed clearly and professionally through the speakers. "Control tower, Citation 907 Alpha, requesting clearance for taxiing and takeoff. Demonstration flight with an estimated duration of 15 minutes. The silence that followed was unsettling. Thomas rushed to the communications control, but the tower's response came before he could interfere. "Citation 907 Alpha, clearance granted. Welcome back, Captain Williams." The words "welcome back" struck the hangar like lightning. Jennifer let out a muffled cry. Marcus Stevens gulped. Richard nearly dropped his cell phone. "Captain." Thomas stammered, his face draining of color. What does welcome back mean?" It was Jennifer who, with trembling hands, ran to his laptop and began typing frantically. "Deborah Williams, commercial pilot, captain." Her eyes widened as she read. "My God. What?" Thomas shouted, desperate. "Captain Deborah Williams," Jennifer read aloud, her voice rising in disbelief. First black woman to command international commercial flights in the United States. 47 years of impeccable service. 35,000 flight hours. Chief instructor at the Civil Aviation Academy until her retirement in 2023. The hangar fell silent, except for the sound of engines warming up. Thomas staggered as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Wait a minute," Jennifer continued reading, her voice now trembling with emotion. She saved 243 lives in an emergency landing during a storm in 1998. She was decorated by Congress. She has more civilian service medals than any active pilot. Richard approached slowly, still recording, but now with reverence instead of scorn. "And we treated her like a beggar," Marcus finished, shame weighing on his voice. Through the cockpit window, everyone could see Deborah performing the pre-flight procedures with surgical precision. Every movement was economical, perfect, the result of decades of excellence that he had been too blind to recognize. Thomas, desperate, rushed to the radio. "Stop. Stop this now. This was a misunderstanding." Deborah's voice returned, calm as ever. "Mr. Whitmore, you made a bet. You said you'd give me this plane if I could fly it. Well, I'm flying it." "But I didn't know who he was," he shouted into the microphone. "Does it matter?" The question echoed through the hangar. His offer was based on his belief that I couldn't do this because of his appearance. The color of his skin, his age, his clothes. It wasn't based on his knowledge or ability. The aircraft began to move slowly through the hangar toward the runway. Jennifer ran up to Thomas with the laptop. "Look at this," she said, showing the screen. "Her has more flying experience than every pilot in this city combined." On the screen were photographs of Deborah over the decades, young and proud in her first pilot's uniform, receiving awards, saving lives, breaking barriers that no black woman had broken before. "For 47 years, Deborah's voice continued over the radio as the aircraft positioned itself on the runway, "I faced men like you. Men who thought they could judge her for anything except her competence." Thomas ran down the runway, shouting for her to stop, but it was too late. The Citation accelerated smoothly, and in a matter of seconds it was in the air, climbing in a perfect curve that demonstrated a mastery that left everyone speechless. "Holy Mary," whispered Richard, still recording. "She's flying like an angel." For 15 minutes, Deborah performed maneuvers that turned that flight into an aerial symphony. Simulated landings, precise turns, a display of technical mastery that brought several observers in the hangar to tears of emotion. When she landed, as soft as a feather touching the ground, Thomas was on his knees on the runway. Not in worship, but in utter despair. He realized he had humiliated not only an innocent woman, but a living aviation legend. Deborah stepped out of the aircraft with her usual calm. She walked over to Thomas, who remained prostrate, and held out the keys. "You can have his plane, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "I never wanted his aircraft. I just wanted him to understand the price of judging people by their appearance." Jennifer approached, tears streaming down her face. "Captain Williams, we have no words to." Deborah smiled kindly. "You learned something today. That's what matters." Thomas, still on the ground, looked up with red eyes. Why didn't you say who you were from the beginning?" "Because," Deborah replied, "if I had, you would have changed your behavior. And then you would never have learned the lesson she needed to learn." What Thomas Whitmore couldn't understand, as he stood humiliated on the runway before the living legend he had tried to destroy, was that this night would mark not only the end of his arrogance, but the beginning of a transformation that would echo far beyond that hangar, a lesson in respect, dignity, and the deadly danger of underestimating the greatness that can reside in anyone, regardless of how she presents herself to the world. 6 months after that transformative night in the Miami hangar, the consequences of Thomas Whitmore's arrogance continued to unfold like ripples on a calm lake. Richard Blackstone's video, showing the millionaire's complete humiliation in front of an aviation legend, had gone viral with over 15 million views. Thomas lost $3 million contracts when the videos reached his business partners. No one wanted to associate her brand with someone who had shown such prejudice and lack of character in public. Her reputation, built on arrogance and family connections, collapsed like a house of cards in a strong wind. Jennifer, the saleswoman who witnessed everything, had been promoted to regional manager after her recording of the event was used in a documentary about pioneering women in aviation. She often told the story to customers, always emphasizing that true greatness does not come with price tags. Marcus Stevens, the businessman who had initially joined in the laughter, became one of the biggest advocates for inclusion programs at his company. "I met a woman who taught me that judging people by their appearance is the most costly mistake anyone can make," he said in his corporate lectures. Deborah Williams, meanwhile, had been invited to be the keynote speaker at the country's largest aviation convention. Her story inspired thousands of young people, especially black women, to pursue careers in aviation. The hangar where it all happened was transformed into a training center that bears his name. Captain Williams asked a young journalist during a recent interview, "What was the most satisfying moment of that night?" Deborah smiled with the same serenity she had shown in the face of humiliation. "It wasn't when I proved I could fly, dear. It was when she realized that experience taught everyone present a lesson they would never forget." Thomas, meanwhile, had been forced to sell a large part of her aircraft fleet to cover her financial losses. In an irony that did not go unnoticed by anyone, one of the aircraft was purchased by a foundation created by Deborah to train pilots from underprivileged communities. "Sometimes," Jennifer reflected during an interview for an aviation magazine, "life has a sense of justice that surpasses any human planning." That night changed us all, but most importantly, it taught us that greatness can be hidden behind any appearance. The most powerful lesson of that night was not about aviation or wealth. It was about the devastating price of judging people by their outward appearance. Thomas Whitmore learned in the most painful way possible that the true measure of a person is not in his clothes, her bank account, or her skin color, but in his character, experience, and dignity. Deborah never sought revenge. She simply allowed the truth to do its work. When he decides to humiliate another human being based on prejudice, he is actually digging his own social and professional grave. The best revenge, Deborah often says in her lectures, is to live such a full and meaningful life that her detractors realize how small his own horizons were. Today, when young pilots visit the Deborah Williams Training Center, they see not only one of the greatest legends in American aviation, but a living example that human dignity is indestructible. No matter how many times they try to knock us down, we can always get up and fly higher than our detractors ever imagined possible. Thomas tried to break the spirit of a woman who dedicated 47 years to the skies. Instead, he broke his own reputation and discovered that some people are so big that they don't fit into the small molds created by prejudice. Deborah's story teaches us that when we encounter someone trying to diminish us, perhaps the answer is not to react with anger, but to demonstrate through our actions how wrong they were. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply to be his true self, regardless of who doubts him. That night in the hangar proved that true humility comes from those who have real reasons to be proud, while arrogance often masks the insecurity of those who have never achieved anything on their own merit. If this story touched his heart and made him reflect on how we treat those around us, leave a comment telling us about a similar experience he's had or witnessed. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how dignity always triumphs over prejudice, and don't forget to share with someone who needs to remember that our outward appearance never defines our inner value.